Colleagues, good afternoon. We're very happy to see you all here. We're about to start the press conference by the Governor of the Bank of Russia, Elvira Nabiullina, and the Deputy Governor, Alexei Zabotkin, which is about our today's key rate decision. We will begin with the statement by the Governor following the Board of Directors meeting. Good afternoon. Today we have made the decision to decrease the key rate by 150 basis points to 9.5% per annum. Inflation is slowing down, including owing to a stronger ruble and lower inflation expectations. This made it possible to cut the key rate again today. However, the very low price growth rates we have been observing in recent weeks cannot be considered to be steadily low inflation. They are mostly associated with a downward adjustment of prices after the surge in March. Moreover, pro-inflationary risks are still considerable. I would now dwell on the factors behind our today's decision. First, price growth significantly decelerated in May, early June. However, we're not too optimistic about this fact. Indeed, prices in a small group of products, making approximately 10% of the consumer basket, did not simply rise more slowly in May, but even declined. These were mostly food products, generally characterized by elevated price volatility, certain fruits and vegetables, eggs and sugar. Prices for durable goods edged down as well, although they had been growing at a double-digit price until just recently. Speaking of the absolute majority of products, prices are still considerably above 4% in annualized terms, despite their slower rise. In February-March, households stocked up with goods and non-perishable foods for several months ahead. People are using them gradually, due to which they are probably buying less currently. Furthermore, businesses notably raised prices, fearing a weakening of the ruble, among other things. Today, when the situation has stabilized, not all people are ready to purchase goods at such prices, hence prices are adjusting downwards. Nonetheless, the situation might reverse. Stocks will run out and people will consume by making new purchases. I would like to emphasize that the decline in prices for certain goods in April-May offset their surge in March only partially. Specifically, prices for computers, TV sets, washing machines and smartphones dropped by 9 to 17% over the 2 months, after soaring by 15 to 46% in March. An important sign of a stabilizing situation is that household inflation expectations are returning to the levels of the previous year. Answering the question about the reasons for lower inflation expectations, people noted that the strong wave of price growth has already passed and a deficit of FMC goods has been prevented. Companies' price expectations also continued to decrease, returning to the level of the end of 2021. Among the reasons, businesses mention both a slower rise in costs, including the ones due to exchange rate movements and lower prices for motor fuel, and a weaker demand for their products. However, enterprises and households' expectations are still notably above the levels observed when inflation was close to 4%. Considering these trends, we decreased our inflation forecast for 2022. We estimate that price growth will equal 14 to 17% as of the end of the year. The forecast for 2023 remained unchanged, namely 5 to 7%. Further on, inflation will return to the target. Second, according to our assessment, the decline in economic activity discontinued in May. Speaking of external trade, export quantities contracted less than we expected in April, whereas import trends were generally in line with our estimates. Today, most companies engaged in external trade are facing problems. These bottlenecks are associated with establishing relations with new suppliers, making payments, searching new target markets, and delivering goods via new routes. Debottlenecking will take a long time. Moreover, there are still risks of secondary sanctions. Economic trends across industries are still diverse. Heterogeneity has increased. On the one hand, we can see local improvements according to recent figures, including survey results. In particular, the Business Climate Index we started publishing in June shows that companies have been expressing less negative estimates of the current and future economic situations for 2 consecutive months. Enterprises in those industries where import substitution processes are more active report more notable improvements, for instance in pharmaceuticals, certain machine building sectors and metal processing. The situation in agriculture is generally stable. On the other hand, those industries where external trade plays a key role record a contraction of output. These are export-oriented companies, namely the oil and gas sector, wood processing and coal mining, and enterprises critically dependent on imported equipment and components, including car makers and other assembly plants. Another bottleneck is enterprises' dependence on the maintenance of foreign production lines, machinery, and other equipment. Heterogeneity is high across both industries and regions. Specifically, a considerable number of companies in the Northwest are traditionally focused on European markets and therefore face a more significant decline. Contrastingly, those regions that supply their goods mostly to Asia are adapting to the new environment more quickly. The downturn in the agro-industrial and tourism regions in the south of Russia was also not as intense because they have a large share of small and medium-sized businesses and are rather focusing on the domestic market. We always take into account the latest data received from Russian regions when we prepare our decision. I would like to remind you that before the quiet period, we have been releasing the Regional Economy Report. This review has been published for 18 months already and provides assessment of the situation in Russian regions prepared by the Bank of Russia. Speaking of consumer activity, we could see that it weakened in April-May. Retail turnover declined by nearly 10% year-on-year. There are at least 3 reasons for this reduction. Firstly, demand adjusted downwards after soaring in late February, early March. Secondly, households' savings in the last 3 months were driven by high deposit rates. Thirdly, the growth of consumer lendings slowed down. This could be associated with both high interest rates and the fact that people had mostly made large purchases that often require such loans earlier, like household appliances and electronic devices. We believe that now these factors start to reverse. The overall stabilization and better expectations about economic prospects will support consumers' confidence. The expansion of social support programs and the indexation of pensions that have already been included in the budget will also revive consumer activity. As households use their stocks, consumption will start to return to its usual levels. Unemployment, it remained record low in April. However, during the last month, increasingly more companies started to introduce part-time employment schemes. Some indicators show that the demand for a range of specialists is declining somewhat. Further trends in the labor market will depend on the scale and pace of the structural transformation and the workforce mobility. Third, monetary conditions eased in some segments, but remained tight overall. According to high-frequency indicators, the growth in lending, especially in the retail segment, slowed down in May. Nonetheless, there are grounds to believe that the key rate decrease in May will support lending already beginning from June. The yield curve of federal government bonds declined to 9% across almost all maturities. Banks are also revising their credit rates downwards. However, due to high economic uncertainty, elevated non-price requirements for borrowers remain an additional factor of the tightness of credit conditions. When making a decision on the level of the key rate, we take into account the impact of this factor on credit activity and monetary policy transmission. We will also continue to closely monitor trends in time deposits and how they will change after the deposits opened at high interest rates in March and April mature. I will now speak of possible risks to our forecasts. Pro-inflationary risks continue to go down, while still remaining considerable. Fiscal policy is becoming expansionary. We factored this in when making our recent decisions. If fiscal policy is eased further, pro-inflationary pressure might turn out to be stronger than predicted in the forecast. To bring inflation back to the target in 2024, we might need to pursue a tighter monetary policy than we assume today. After the government approves decisions on the fiscal rule for the next 3 years, we will be able to assess more accurately the medium-term impact of fiscal policy on the economy and inflation. Pro-inflationary risks also include supply-side risks, in our opinion. This is primarily related to manufacturers that are strongly dependent on imports. They are facing unprecedented challenges as they need to rearrange their technological, production, and logistical chains. Without this, they will not be able to replenish the stocks needed for the economy. First and foremost, I mean non-food goods. If the stocks diminish and their replenishment remains difficult, this will limit production capacities and might exacerbate inflationary pressure. External conditions. They involve a whole range of risks. The combination of these conditions and their development over time will determine their overall effect on the economy and inflation. These are the major factors of uncertainty. Firstly, the impact of the oil embargo. If Russian oil exports plummet, this will provoke pro-inflationary pressure due to a contraction of the balance of trade and a weaker ruble. A lot will depend on how much oil the country will be able to redirect to other markets, as well as the extent to which the slump in oil exports will be offset by the price. This, in turn, will depend on the elimination of infrastructure and logistical problems and the demand for oil in new target markets. Secondly, the risks of a global recession are growing. If they materialize, the global demand for Russian exports will decrease, which will accelerate inflation through a weaker ruble. Thirdly, a contraction of Russian exports might also involve disinflationary risks if companies are forced to redirect their products to the domestic market because of the impossibility to reestablish export chains. Fourthly, a key factor will be trends in imports, specifically how quickly the volume of imports will restore and how it will correlate with export quantities. As you can see, external conditions involve a very large number of possible factors that might have diverse influence. We will assess all changes and the mutual effects of these processes. Winding up, I would like to comment on monetary policy prospects in the conditions of unprecedented uncertainty. We need to adjust our policy as follows. On the one hand, it should not hinder the structural transformation of the economy. On the other hand, we need to avoid stagflation risks. In the first case, we might face a problem if the level of the key rate is too high in a situation where demand contracts more considerably than supply. In the second case, a problem might arise if the key rate is too low, when companies lack real opportunities to ramp up supply, and if we reduce the key rate too quickly, and thus the response to price dynamics observed today is excessive. If the situation develops in line with the baseline forecast, we will gradually decrease the key rate further as steady inflation slows down. We will consider the necessity of a further key rate reduction at our upcoming meetings. The time and the size of the reduction will largely depend on the pace of a decrease in households and businesses' inflation expectations, as well as on how companies will rearrange their production chains in the new conditions and how successfully they will address supply-side constraints. According to the updated forecast and our today's decision, the average key rate will equal 10.8 to 11.4% per annum this year, or 7 to 9% in 2023, and 6 to 7% in 2024. Thank you for your attention. Dear colleagues, now your questions. Let me remind you that today, like was the last time, we work in a hybrid format. Some of the questions we will be receiving online. And please do not forget to introduce yourselves and name your agency. Please, Anastasia. Yes, according to tradition. The microphone is first yours. Anastasia Saveleva, Interfax, good afternoon. You have already mentioned that the current price rate pace must not be considered as a stable one. Do you expect the inflation trend to reverse as the one-off factors exhaust themselves from the possible impact from the fiscal policy? That is my first question. The second, you previously stated that you may be going back to your standard phasing in terms of the monetary policy once the rate achieves some single-digit value. Have we gone back to that? Can we talk about the fine-tuning? And also another question, you were talking about the export embargo. How strong its impact may be upon a trade balance? And do you agree with the view that the price growth may help to compensate for that effect? With regard to the price rate growth decline, we expect that it will continue to play out and the one-off factors will disappear, but we expect that the stable components, they are going down right now, but they are staying about 4, but they will continue their decline. And you are definitely right. One of the factors here will be the further monetary policy pursuit, because we're currently acting on the decisions so far made and announced, but the fiscal process for the following years is currently being debated, and we believe it is very important to revisit this, or in longer term, to this or that fiscal rule, and for the better understanding of what kind of the fiscal framework this might be, because it impacts monetary policy. Now, as far as switching to the standard phased approach to the key rate, I was rather meaning to say that when our key rate within the double-digit range, such standard step as 0.25, well, obviously, yes, we are moving at bigger strides, which are applicable, but when moving towards the single-digit rates, we will consider every time, and the phase will depend upon the specificities of our forecasting carrying forward, because the situation is uncertain, many things are changing, so it's impossible to predict such a stage of phasing every time. You can talk about the standard steps once we get into the fine-tuning mode. Now, with regard to the impact from the embargo upon oil and oil refined products, yes, it is there. It is a negative one, but the strength of this impact will be dependent upon many factors, and the price factor will definitely play a role here. So this impact, firstly, shall depend upon whether it would be possible and to what extent it would be possible to redirect exports towards away from the countries that introduced embargo towards other markets. Secondly, it will depend upon the price factor, which in its turn shall be dependent upon the global environment and the way the global economy develops. And we see that it is slowing down, and the demand for the Russian exportables may go further down, and also the price conditions related to the discounting. So I would say that these are the main factors, and we will monitor the way it will all unfold. Next, Anna, please. The last row, Anna Kalidin from Izvestia. I also have two questions, if I may. The first one, we're not having a very conventional situation because there's a big spread between the level of inflation and the key rate, and also such a high spread between the key rate and the banking industry's interest rates. You mentioned that the May decline may somewhat push the lending activity upwards in May, but when do you expect this lending activity to revive and the spreads to shorten between the key rate and the bank's interest rates? And my second question is related, but it's about the currency. As the central bank announced today that it's going to review the banking fees issue. Well, of course, we understand that it's all about one bank which is trying to recourse, there's upon the previously established contracts because you cannot withdraw money, but if you don't want to deal with us, you need to transfer money elsewhere, and so people feel that they are entrapped. Now, could there be any measures undertaken towards that bank, not only of a prudential nature, but of others towards that bank? Thank you very much for these questions. As far as the loan rates being largely different from the key rate, yes, indeed, this is the case, and that is what we described as the price conditions for lending becoming tighter, because there are the opposing ones as well when requirements are being placed upon the adequacy level, but and the securitization. But in the price terms related to lending, that is the way the banks reflect the borrower's risk, because it's one thing when you are lending to a company which has a straightforward sales market and easily to comprehend where such a company gets its parts and inputs. Many companies currently are reorganizing their supply chains, and there is a lot of uncertainties with their target markets. So in a very natural way, such risks have strengthened, and the banks are trying to assess them. Now, why? This is the risk mitigation practice, because they ought to think about other customer base that they have, the depositors, that the money must come back, and the interests of the depositors and lenders must be protected. Well, maybe Alexei Borisovich would also add something in as far as this point is concerned, including the spread between the key rate and the inflation. Yes, thank you very much. To what the governor just explained in terms of additional risk premium, I would like to get back to what was mentioned during the presentation. We understand that the risk premium has grown. Yes, we do understand that the non-priced conditions have toughened, and we do take it into account when making our assessment of the transmission mechanism of our key rate into the lending rates that the banks are offering. And so we are hoping that gradually it will all come to the previous levels, but in the meantime we select the level of the key rate, being aware that this risk premium for some time will remain higher. Now, speaking about the difference between inflation and the key rate, here the question is about what kind of inflation you're talking about. If you talk about the previous 12 months long inflation level, honestly, the difference is quite material, which is 17.1% based on the recent weekly data. We have lowered the rate today down to 9.5%. But this is conditioned by the fact that this is inflation from the previous period, and the similar situation, although less expressed if you take a look, it was in 2015 when we also were reducing our rate against the fact when the annual inflation was still remaining long, and inside itself there was a lot of strong price hikes towards the end of 2013-14. But what is important for the monetary conditions and transmission of the monetary policy, it is not the past inflation, but the expected inflation for the future period. And so in this sense, if you compare the current key rate level with our forecast inflation, then altogether the kind of policy that is currently being pursued, it fits into the framework of what can be described as a moderately tight policy. But here I would like to underscore that this spread is something that many people look at differently, because some believe that the key rate is considerably below the inflation if you annualize it. But let's say if you take a look at the current weekly inflation and you further juxtapose it and annualize it, some would believe that the key rate is higher than the inflation. But we act on an assumption that the conclusions based upon the weekly inflation values, which in many ways has been brought about by the current set of factors, should not be done. A proper approach is the one that Mr. Zabotkin referred to, that the key rate impacts the cost of provisioning the resources or the attraction of the deposit for the future period, and you definitely need to look and compare the forecast with the expectations. And so with respect to the currency question and the banking fees, yes, indeed, we are scrupulously watching this situation, and as previously mentioned, we act on the expectation that the banks are not supposed to worsen the terms offered under the existing contracts to their customer base. I mean, as far as the deposits are concerned, I would like to emphasize once again, here, no increase is permitted or introducing any fee, because that would be in direct violation of the law. Now, and as far as the accounts and different kinds of transfers are concerned, you need to really take a close look at what the contracts say, because different banks have decided differently, and so we will sort things out with each individual bank. If there are respective violations, we will be applying measures which we're entitled to apply according to what actually is the case. But one should also understand that under the sanctions and various restrictions, the currency transactions involving banks and households do carry certain risks. That is why the banks are trying to reduce their currency volumes and may even stop offering certain products denominated in currencies. But it is important for all of this to be compliant with all of the customer rights of the banks. And so this is what we monitor closely. And so we will look into every detail about every single bank in terms of how compliant it is with the legislation and the existing contracts. Colleagues, please. Delia. Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Dilara Novosti. You mentioned such a term as stagflation. You even listed the factors which may lead to stagflation. But nevertheless, how do you assess the risks of stagflation emerging in Russia? Are they high? Do you reflect them in your basic forecast, or this is just being pessimistic? This is my first question. And my second question about the fiscal rule. You also referred to the fiscal policy, and we are aware that currently the Minister of Finance is developing a new fiscal rule. Are you involved in the discussion of this? And in your mind, what kind of a new fiscal rule we should have? Well, as far as the stagflation risks are concerned, no, we are not putting them into a baseline forecast. And our policy is aimed at such risks not coming true. That's what we act upon. Now, with respect to the fiscal rule, yes, we are involved in a certain general discussion with the Minister of Finance about the need, therefore, but it's too premature to talk about any specific propositions. All right, so the next question comes from one of the regions. Yes, it comes from online. Alina Melnikova, The Island of Freedom, publication from the city of Volgograd. Go ahead. Yes, good afternoon. We've got the following question. Following the reduction of the key rate, the lending rates also have followed suit, although the banks are not in a rush to issue loans trying to assess the borrowers. How correct this is and appropriate for them to do, and will the banks somehow reduce the tightness of the risk assessment? Thank you very much for the questions. We referred to it several times today. We do see that the banks have tightened their requirements placed upon the borrowers, which are non-priced ones as well. The banks are being more cautious in their approach to borrowers. Risk assessment, this is because the credit risks truly have grown along with the economic restructuring, and the banks must have an opportunity to assess them. I shall remind you once again, if a borrower turns out to be not a credit-worthy one, I would say respectively, other depositors and lenders must not suffer, because the banks is responsible for both the money of depositors and lenders. But we do indeed establish our key rate, bearing in mind this additional margin of toughness related to the non-priced terms and conditions. I believe that as long as the structural transformation of the economy carries on, the companies will be organizing new logistical chains and new technological processes. The level of assessment by the banks of such risks will go down, and so the requirements placed upon the borrowers will soften up. Colleagues, please. Inna. Inna Udoshna from Frank Media. I will have two questions, if I may. The first one is about National Welfare Fund. In the beginning of July, the European Union introduced sanctions against the National Welfare Fund, and in this way legitimized the freezing of assets and transactions which took place after the depository breach collapsed between the Russian and the foreign infrastructure in the beginning of March. And so, in terms of there being a prohibition or a ban on transactions and the asset deposition hasn't been there, so some of the investors, both Russian and foreign ones, are preparing to litigate in order to contest this freeze. Does the Bank of Russia plan to participate in such claims, or maybe in a certain other way dispute the freezing of its transactions on behalf of the Russian investors? And generally speaking, does the Bank of Russia, in its capacity as a mega regulator and as one of the shareholders of the Moscow Exchange, to contest the sanctions against the National Welfare Fund, or somehow contest and re-establish the bridge between the Euroclear and the Russian structure? This is the first set of questions. The second group of questions is about the reporting forms, because the financial market players asked the Bank of Russia to change its approach to disclosure of the financial information, including in the form of the IFRS. Does the Bank of Russia plan to change these approaches, or maybe somehow implement certain definitive norms, or change them, including for the banking sector? I guess this is it. Thank you. Well, as far as the second question, let me respond quickly, because we are in the process of discussing it right now. And so we're going to take a look at what needs to be done here and what we can do. But as far as the National Welfare Fund is concerned, these limitations on transactions were introduced because the international accounting systems restricted transactions from the fund's accounts and made it impossible for the securities to move into other institutions. And so these limitations apply to the possibility of selling such paper in the securities market, because one should avoid the kind of risk whereby the buyers of such securities, quite often non-qualified investors who are not aware of the consequences of such a freeze, should not be buying the securities. Because systemically, the problem remains, and in order for a buyer trying to sell such securities through the exchange infrastructure could sell it to quite a broad class of non-qualified investors. But such securities can be sold in the out-of-exchange market with discounts and so on and so forth. As far as our participation in different processes is concerned and preparing to litigate, this kind of work to prepare the best tactics and the best strategy is currently underway. This is not a simple work. This is quite a complex effort. So I suppose this is everything that I can comment on this right now. The next question comes from online. Alexander Wild, Life and Invest Project. Sasha, go ahead. Yes, good afternoon. You have already started talking about investors, and I would like to raise a question about the kind of investor protection policy that the central bank is currently pursuing, because you already mentioned that the investors in the foreign frozen assets, some of the investors had margin calls extended to them because the brokers didn't take that as the securitization. People are losing tax breaks when moving their investments from one brokers to others. So the brokers, some of the brokers are under sanctions. So there is a situation that people end up having two margin calls, and so the tax authorities reject their deductions, and so people will fall under the penalties. So there is also another problem that the investors confront. Is central bank working on such problems? If it does, if it is, then how and what kind of decisions we should expect here? And if I may, I would also raise my second question. Could you please explain whether Russia at this point in time is capable of servicing its foreign commitments, its foreign debts, and if Russia won't have such possibility, its default on foreign debts, what would it mean specifically for the ordinary Russians as well as for investors? Thank you. As far as the investor rights protections are concerned, this is one of the priorities in our policy. Even before the foreign restrictions came to be, you know, we took measures which quite often were disliked by the financial market players when we tried to protect unqualified investors. And many investors are confronted now by many diverse problems. You mentioned some of them, and each problem is what we review separately. In some cases, you need to change the law. In other cases, you need to introduce a new regulation. And of course, we are working every problem, and soon we're going to hold our expert advisory board. We have such in the central bank to consider the retail investor problems in order to make everything systemic so as not to leave anything out. Now, in terms of the EES system you mentioned, yes, indeed, there are some brokers who are under sanctions, and we believe the Central Bank of Russia position is that we will need to introduce changes and amendments into the legislation, because the tax deductions should remain in this case, and investors must be given an opportunity to have two operating systems and accounts. If one is blocked, no, you can still have the other one so as to retain your tax deduction entitlement. So this is the kind of change that we need to introduce. As far as the foreign debt servicing is concerned, we know quite often default is being defined as inability and unwillingness on the part of a borrower to pay. So from the point of view of the financial resources, you know, we've got all the capabilities. We also have the willingness to pay. And, you know, the Minister of Finance demonstrated all possible options that it was trying to follow. Now, the problem that Russia is currently facing is explained by technical difficulties to pay its sovereign debt in currencies because of the restrictions imposed in the international banking transaction systems. Along with that, usually, when a problem to pay sovereign debt is concerned, this is a fiscal problem, but we don't have any whatsoever. So we've got all of the resources in our hands to pay our debts. As a rule, the inability to pay sovereign debt results in the outflow of investors in terms of the consequences. This is the outflow of investors, the sovereign asset values decline. But in the case of Russia, that has already occurred. And so there is no expectation of any immediate ramification. But I shall underscore that this whole situation does not impact at all the ability of the government to act on its commitments to the Russian citizens, to the Russian residents who bought into the federal bonds of Russia. Colleagues, Anna, please, in the last row. Anna Lazareva, Russia 24. Elvira Nabiullina, I've got two questions. The first is about the foreign stock situation. You partially have commented on it, but nevertheless many investors are raising a question why central bank, whose task it is to protect investors, didn't warn the share owners about a possible blocking of their broker accounts, and generally whether it was possible. And what about the future of Mikhail Zadornov? Where can we see him after the Odkrytie Discovery Bank is merged with VTB? Well, as far as foreign shares are concerned, to forewarn about the possibility of the introduction of the future sanctions was practically impossible, because the risk related to investing into the foreign securities, and the central bank has always been vocal about it, but that there are all kinds of different regulatory risks related to the fact that these are foreign issuers' shares. We've always been saying that, but nowadays, the basic thing is to look at how these problems can be solved, by the investors who ended up being in such a predicament. And of course, together with the marketplace, we're going to be actively working together. As far as Mikhail Zadornov is concerned, you should direct those questions to him. Rita, please, go ahead. Thanks very much, Rita Spilevskaya from TASS agency. I would like to go back to the currency accounts. The introduction of the negative rates or the currency accounts, has it been discussed, and is there an understanding of the currency in question? Because back in 2019 it was mentioned that the negative rate was to be introduced on the euro rates. Would there be any limitations of the such negative rates? That is, as far as the corporates are concerned. As far as the households are concerned, I would like to hear an assurance that there wouldn't be any forceful conversion of the currency accounts into rubles. Well, as far as the currency account negative rates are concerned, indeed, what we're talking right now is about a possible legislative change, and it is only about corporates. And as far as conversion is concerned, we're not talking about any forceful conversions. Thank you very much. Next question comes from online. Anton Tsepilov, Argumenti and Fakti from the Orenburg. I've got the following question. What do you think? Would it be normal to consider when such smart attempts are being undertaken to bypass the key rate when certain parallel instruments are being produced? We're talking about the industrial mortgage, where the rate is much lower than the key rate. Also, certain farming and agricultural projects which have rates much lower, without mentioning the housing mortgage. Isn't there a bit of a discrepancy? Yeah, that it is expensive, but you can have it cheaper. Wouldn't it be more logical to come to some sort of a single level, so as not to diverge in between different sectors and opportunities? Well, thank you very much for the question. Indeed, there is an issue like that. You are absolutely correct that various subsidized programs, they do impact the rates for the borrower at large, but in our mind, such subsidized programs, you may find them both in the household mortgage and in subsidizing lending in different industries. They may be very much sought after and very appropriate in their capacity as an anti-crisis measure through an acute stage of a crisis. In case we witness a serious tightening of the monetary policy, like when we dramatically raise the key rate. These are very specific measures by the government, which is trying to pursue structural policy and industrial policy in order to support certain economic sectors. But, of course, in terms of growing the volume of such subsidized lending, makes it into some of the loans becoming less sensitive to our monetary policy. And that is why we have to keep the key rate a little bit above in order to achieve the same kind of an outcome. And against all things being equal, that would mean higher rates for the rest of the borrowers. So in our view, such subsidized programs is something that one should, and it is appropriate to have them, but only within a certain limited period of time and in limited volume. And then you need to give up on it in favor of having a better opportunity set to reduce the rates for all the borrowers. Dear colleagues, Dmitry, please. Dmitry Butenko from Kommersant, because this press conference is about the key rate, let me just, for diversity purposes, go back to this particular question. What kind of options you had on the table? This is a question that not really the reporters are asking. Other questions are about your forecast. First of all, the forecast changed actually throughout May, and so with this in mind, I would like you to comment what kind of GDP components and in inflation turned out to be different throughout this month. Could you please submit again? Yeah, turned out to be out of worthy of accounting for. And I would like to also comment because of that on the current account balance. Next question to Mr. Zabotkin. Quite obviously, the inflationary pressure, because the industry is getting out of stock, is going to be felt in autumn. But will we see this trend as a curve on the charts in the autumn? Well, thank you very much. We really had quite a broad range of options on the table, in between 9 to 11% as the key rate, but the basic debate was in between 9 to 9.5 to 10. Now, with regard to the forecast, our assessments with regard to many indicators is something that we have updated, and we will share the updates by July when we will have our core meeting, because currently we have shared information about inflation and the key rate. But of course we do see that a number of processes in the economy are unfolding not the way we expected them to back in April. Primarily applicable to exports, as I mentioned. Exports demonstrate better results in terms of the payment balance. Imports are almost exactly as we expected. But I would say that these are the basic points. Of course, the decline in the lending activity is something that we had been expecting, but hopefully there will be a gradual restoration of it. And I would ask Mr. Zabotkin to maybe also finish commenting on this one as well as the second question. Thank you very much. With regard to reviewing our forecast, indeed, the changes are substantive, and it is related to the inflation trajectory. I mean, the price rate, growth rate, which started taking place as of the second half of April until now, as the governor just mentioned, because in your question you effectively already answered your own question, because indeed it is related to the fact that the payment balance dynamics was considerably supported by the fact that exports didn't contract significantly, but in nominal terms it is growing year on year, bearing in mind higher global prices, and that produced a different trajectory, and more solid exchange rate produced greater disinflation, also through quite a favorable effect upon the speed of the inflation expectations disappearing. I mean, this is still remaining quite strong, but if we compare it to 2015, it is going down faster. I mean, and so exchange rate dynamics continues to play an important role. Now, going over to your second question, I suppose for the second half of the year, the topic of available stocks is not the only issue which may impact the monthly and respectively annual inflation dynamics, because traditionally we will have quite a seasonality related to the crop yield, which may introduce certain adjustments here and there, and without doubt the speed of the revival of the demand, bearing in mind also the lending reaction to quite a quick key rate reduction down to the February levels, would also bear a significant impact upon the overall price growth. What I may say, considering the fact that the revision of the forecast was material in terms of what it presupposes, I mean, the price growth rate in the second half will remain almost the same. So this revision is a bit of a surprise in terms of the inflation over the 2 months in many ways, and a bit of a decline in the inflation expectations. But the extent to which we'll be able to see it in the chart, if we knew, that really would have been great, because we would have ended up with a much narrower range of forecasts, but that remains quite a broad one, 14 to 17. That is not conditioned by the fact that we have strong doubts about the trajectory of the stable part, because there is a bit of a leeway there, but that is conditioned by the fact that the one-off factors, including the ones that you have mentioned, are truly remaining the factors of big uncertainty. Thank you so much. Now, the next question comes from Yevgenia Pispina from Bloomberg. Even 2 questions. The first one, the Russians have been dreaming so much about a solid ruble, and now the dream has come true. Ruble is becoming stronger and stronger, but somehow nobody is happy about it. Now, what will happen to ruble furthermore? Can the central bank do something in order to depreciate it? Now, the second question is, you are saying that the decline in the economic activity is registered to a lesser extent than you saw in April. Why is it happening so? It turns out that the sanction, in fact, turned out not to be as strong upon Russia as it seemed to be in the beginning. As far as the currency exchange rate is concerned, despite the fact that currency restrictions have been introduced and so on and so forth, we adhere to the policy of a floating exchange rate within this policy. And so the exchange rate and its fluctuations influences different economic entities differently. The exporters often are interested in weaker rubles, the importers in the stronger ruble, and maybe there is one group of economic entities which previously had been involved in terms of what they were doing in defining the exchange rate, which was a balancing one. There are a few of them, I mean, the foreign investors into Russian assets, but nevertheless, the exchange rate remains a floating one, and it, to a large extent, is currently being defined by the current account and the correlation between the imports and exports, and in many ways is going to be defined by these factors. Now, changing the key rate, we to a lesser extent are impacting. There's no immediate effect in terms of the inflow or outflow of capital, but nevertheless, for example, the monetary policy and our rate may impact to a large extent or to a lesser extent imports and exports, and in this way impact the exchange rate, but it's going to be more durable in time. But at the same time, let me remind you that we set our monetary policy and the key rate based on the need to achieve the inflation target. Now, as far as whether the situation is becoming better, yes, let me repeat it again. We do see that our exports haven't gone down as we originally expected. And yes, while the sanctional effects manifest themselves not as strongly as we anticipated, that demonstrates the ability of companies to adjust. But to say that the sanctions have manifested themselves in full is premature. In the situation is uncertainty, the situation of the structural transformation of the economy and its capacity to reform and transform. It is also a process. And so making any conclusions really is too soon. Dear colleagues, Vika, please, the second row. Good afternoon, Victoria Shatkina, blogger. may allow to go back to the issue of investors because there are so many questions. There are quite a lot of them who, entered the Russian exchange. To what extent do you believe it is safe right now for Russian investors to buy the foreign stocks or foreign securities through the St. Petersburg exchange? And how do you assess the probability that the same scenario may emerge like was with the National Depository that is going to be blocked? And the second question is about ambiguity of the new currency regulation when the citizens were allowed to transfer money into foreign brokerage accounts and to buy securities through the organized trading. But many would like to sell out because of these ambiguous formulations. They're not certain whether they will be able to do that without being fined. Thank you. Well, in terms of the foreign securities, once again, or foreign stocks, the risks that we mentioned, like we said, that these securities are being regulated by foreign jurisdictions, and these risks have materialized partially. So this is the risk that you have to bear in mind for the future as well. Definitely. Now, as far as the currency regulation is concerned, if there is a need to sell securities and have your proceeds credited to your foreign accounts, the Commission has to give you a decision. If the coupons and dividends without the sale of securities, then you don't need to have a permit for that. Colleagues, please, Ivan. Ivan Schligen, Forbag, RU. Two quick questions. Whether the central bank is monitoring the disputes and discrepancies taking place between the issues and the retail investors, about dividends or any other issues, whether the central bank monitors such situations. And the second question is whether it is correct for the banks, when opening a brokerage account, to charge 30% per annum simply because of the fact that they open up an account for a new customer. How correct it is, whether it's appropriate or not appropriate, or legitimate to protect new investors. Well, as far as disputes between the issuers and investors are concerned, well, it is the kind of dispute. Of course, we monitor the market. Maybe not all of the disputes is what we see, who do not go out into the public domain because we have a hotline, but we're trying to monitor and watch over the situations which may bear a systemic significance, which may require a change in the regulation. But if such a dispute is about one party violating the rules, then of course such a party is subject to certain imposition of measures. And as far as all kinds of fees and commissions are concerned, principally speaking, the fees, many fees, are established by, remuneration, what do you mean? This is a service which is being paid for in such a form. But in a competitive environment, you need to see whether a certain service and the customer believes that it's too expensive, then it means that the customer should go to a different broker. I understand that this is just acquiring a customer. Well, we need to take a look at whether there is any violation, like a bit of a leaning out into a different, towards a different side. But any additional questions, please speak into the microphone. Next question comes online from Elena Dorgacheva, OTC Gore site from the city of Novosibirsk. Good afternoon. We see that the key rate in such extraordinary circumstances can be raised very high, like it was back in 2014, up to 17%. Now this year it went up to 20%, even more, by 10.5 percentage points. And it happens almost immediately in order to cushion all of the unwanted effects. And when such unfavorable effects are under control, quite often you may hear the economists and the businesses raising a question: why can't you also reduce the rate as dramatically in order to restart the lending, the business development, production development? So in this particular case, until the rate went back to 9.5, 3 months went by, a whole quarter. That is too long. Well, first of all, this is not too long. That is a very quick process, and we raised the key rate from up to 20%, first of all, based on the risks to financial stability, and thereafter, in several strides, very big strides, in as far as this markup concerned related to the financial stability risk, we eliminated it because we're currently looking at the inflation dynamics and at the stable inflation factors. So far, we don't have such a confidence that we were able to achieve the decline in the stable inflation components. So situation requires keeping a very close eye on it, but nevertheless we are moving in large strides in order for the key rate to make it at the kind of a level which will ensure the inflation going down to the 4% in 2024. You had an additional questions, haven't you?
Нет.
No, principally no. No, everything is clear. Thank you very much. Thank you. Colleagues, please. Yes, Margarita. Margarita Mardan from RBK. Well, since my colleagues have touched upon the Discovery Bank and VTB, I would like you to say how soon this is going to come to some sort of a tangible result. And the second question is about the bonds. What kind of risk the central bank sees, of the cost default in case the issues, like the issues, were forbidden to pay rubles for the bonds? And the second question about the substitution bonds that the Minister of Economic Development were talking about. Will it be available to the domestic investors, or the foreign investors will also be able to purchase them? Thank you. Well, as far as the first question is concerned, the possible deal is currently being discussed, and we will inform you about the results once this discussion comes to an end. As far as the possible risks are concerned, related to the possible default, I already mentioned it. We do not see here risks related to the capital outflow, but in order to avoid the cross-default risks, indeed, in a number of contracts, there are certain financial and non-financial triggers written into them. We're currently preparing an amendment into the law which would make it possible not to consider this situation in this category when the lenders demand a pre-term debt repayment, because issues cannot control such a situation. As far as the substitution bonds or the exchange bonds are concerned, this kind of an amendment into the law is being prepared. We definitely support introducing such a substitution or exchange bonds, acting on the assumption that in the first place these must be aimed to protecting Russian investors, because the Russian investors ended up being in a situation when their rights are infringed upon, when the issues money are being paid, but the money actually doesn't reach the recipient. The next question comes from Konstantin Tsigankov, Funny Money Agency.
Добрый день. У меня два простых и взаимосвязанных вопроса. Первый вопрос. Вот сейчас заканчиваются трехмесячные вклады по ставкам 20%, которые открывались в марте. И вот первый вопрос. Многие банки уже начали рассылать такие заманчивые предложения. Вкладывайте деньги в нас. У нас тут 30%, мы вам сделаем этот вклад, плюс финансовые инструменты. Ни слова о риске, разумеется, не произносится в этих рекламных брошюрках. Центробанк как будет наблюдать, будет, извините за выражение, давать по рукам за подобного рода призывы, потому что 30% это какое-то сумасшествие, кажется. И второй маленький вопрос, вот как вы относитесь к тому, что сейчас часть этих средств, с этих вкладов, она пойдет на потребительский рынок. То есть закладываете ли вы этот риск, который может привести к небольшому, наверное, потенциально скачку инфляции?
Spike. Thank you. Yes, indeed, many deposits with higher rates are coming to their term, You may recall that during the pandemic, when we were softening our monetary policy, many deposit rates were also going down, and there were a lot of offerings of different instruments. Some part was a deposit, another was a complex kind of a deposit structure. Yes, we do receive such signals, and we intend to toughen our oversight so that consumers must not be misled by all kinds of complex products. So yes, we will definitely be scrupulously watching over it because the rates are coming down and such a risk may emerge. And it is true that some of the funds that people were having on the high rate deposits may then go out into the consumer market, and that may incentivize the consumer demand, which is welcomed under such circumstances. Dear colleagues, please, Alexander. Yes, hello. Alexander Baruch from Reuters. Do you see any risks for financial stability, inflation and the ruble exchange rate from the bank's decision to introduce fees? It was mentioned previously. And the second question, what is your assessment of the probability that in September the ban on the withdrawal of more than $10,000 from currency accounts may be introduced? And as far as the fees impacting the financial stability and the exchange rate and inflation, we do not see any such impact, because the basic thing here is that it is important to protect the rights of the holders of such accounts. But once again, I shall underscore that we do note such a trend which materialized not only because of the fees, because the fees is just another manifestation of the fact that the banks want to decrease the quantity of the transactions which carry currency risks in them. And this is the kind of a trend that we have always been supporting of. Now, as far as the measures that have been introduced into effect until September, I will get back to you on this issue in September, depending upon how things evolve. Next question comes from online. Veronika Rybalchenko from the Magadan Media Agency. Recently, the key rate has been changing very frequently, going up, going down. So what would you recommend? To deposit money or to withdraw it and spend? What will happen with the mortgage? How it happens so that the ruble has appreciated, and what we, people in the street, get out of it? Well, we avoid offering specific financial advice, not because we know something and we being cagey about it, but indeed, different people have different strategies, saving strategy, investment strategy. It is all dependent upon the level of income and upon the risk appetite, upon the life situation that every individual is in. We're rather talking about certain principles when you go out into the financial market, about being prudent, about being cautious, and when making any decision about the form of savings, of investing, to always understand risk, to follow diversification so as not to put all your eggs into a single basket. I mean, all kinds of different common sense patterns for the retail investors to follow. There was a question about the appreciation of the ruble. Well, there are several reasons to it. Trying to preserve relatively high exports against the imports, contracting, whereby the currency in revenue comes into the country, but the demand on the importers is lower than what it should have been. And the second factor is the reduction of the capital outflow against sanctions and the restrictions that we have introduced in reverse. But the exchange rate depreciation has been conducive to lower inflation and to lower prices, particularly with respect to the goods goods which are dependent upon the exchange rate. But I believe that the benefit of the inflation being down for people in the street is something that you don't have to explain, because the concern related to the price hikes is something that everybody's sentiment and ordinary Russians find this beneficial. But of course, lower inflation also enables one to reduce the interest rates, and as far as long-term loans are concerned, to also makes it possible to make mortgage funding more available. Well, I mean, the mortgage activity somewhat went down after we raised the key rate, but the subsidized program is being rolled out. We are reducing the rate, and we expect the mortgage activity to revive again. Well, dear colleagues, Anastasia, I don't see, I think that you are there in the corner. Good afternoon. Anastasia Boyko from Vedomosti. How strongly in April and May import and exports went down, denominated in specific money, considering the payment balance, and how soon the central bank will be able to share this data? And the second question is, what is the future for your litigation to return the foreign assets? Well, as far as the second question is concerned, this is what we're working on. This is not just a simple exercise that requires a certain time, but as far as imports and exports are concerned, you may talk about trends, because this is not us disclosing these statistics, but the trends is something that we already mentioned. But nevertheless, Mr. Zabotkin, you have something to say about it? Because no, I can simply reiterate that at the quality level, from the point of view of physical volumes, exports went down in April and May, not considerably. Import fell strongly, but in nominal terms, import also fell down, but the exports grew, considering high prices, and the resulting thing from it, the trading balance surplus, which is published in an aggregated form since the beginning of the year. The recent data was disclosed this week. I think you may have seen it. Dear colleagues, our time is coming to an end. We have several new people here. So, Fyodor, please. Introduce yourself. Fyodor Ivanov, Invest Future. Good afternoon. I have three questions. The first one is quite a trivial one, but a very important. Such strong ruble as we're having now, is it something that is a detriment to the Russian economics? And if so, does central bank plan to introduce certain additional instruments? If not, what kind of level is going to be really detrimental? The second question is about paying for the foreign bonds in the unfriendly nations, because the central bank decree is contradicting the protocol of the government commission, specifically with respect to the currency regulation. And my third question is whether there will be any inquest introduced into the FX fund, reducing the values down to zero, or is it outside of the central bank regulation? Well, as far as the exchange rate level is concerned and how damaging it could be to the economics, I will try and say it again. In our mind, negative impact to the economy may come from a controlled exchange rate in the interests of a certain group, be it the importers or exporters. The floating exchange rate is exactly the one that enables us to arrive at a market equilibrium which covers importers, exporters, and all other economic entities. And through our monetary policy, we are not trying to impact any specific exchange rate, although our monetary policy indirectly may generate such an impact. Maybe Mr. Zabotkin will add something on top of this, and I will comment on the other questions. Well, just in a nutshell, let me make it more pronounced. Indeed, the monetary policy definitely impacts the exchange rate. This particular impact currently is more extended in time, exactly like we discussed it at length during the past press conference, but no specific nominal level of an exchange rate is not being targeted by the monetary policy. We are targeting low inflation. And in the end of the day, in the country where the inflation is low, the currency exchange rate is going to be much stronger as opposed to the country where inflation is higher. This is a given. All right. So as far as possible discrepancies in the explanations that we offer in our decrees, could you possibly provide me with specific data in terms of what you mean to say? Because our legal counsels prepare explanations. They don't see any discrepancies, but it would be better to put it down on paper in order for them to sort it out. Can you do that? No, now, I mean after the press conference. All right? And as far as the funds of the FINEX are concerned, indeed, that has been set up not following the Russian legislation. It was done based on the European and Irish legislation, and all of the procedures related to these funds are being pursued within the foreign legal framework. This is not under our supervision. There's no Russian license. It's just that the Moscow Exchange is considering now delisting. Dear colleagues, thank you very much. We hope to see you come to us many more times. Thank you.